I think there is a real revival of political interest in many of these, recognizing that the role of government is to, provide social services and a new interest in the labor movement. And I think that has helped shift the debate away from one that is focused on, skills and training being the solution, to one that's actually, even if we increase skills, if elites can always develop new mechanisms of controlling access to the top positions, then what we're going to see is just sort of this credentials race. Like if it's not a college degree, it'll be a master's degree, or it'll be a professional degree later on. So education on its own can't solve that process if we're in an extremely unequal economy.
Hello and welcome. Tonight, Dr. Cristina Groeger will discuss her new book, The Education Trap: Schools and the Remaking of Inequality in Boston. She'll be in conversation with Dr. Hilary Moss, the author of Schooling Citizens: The African-American Struggle for Education in Antebellum America. From the Boston Public Library, I'm Kristen Motti. Before Cristina and Hilary join us, here is a little bit about each of tonight's guests. Dr. Cristina Groeger is an assistant professor of history at Lake Forest College in Illinois. Her research has been funded by the National Academy of Education, the Spencer Foundation, and published in several academic journals. Before beginning graduate school, Dr. Groeger was a high school history teacher in Pennsylvania. She grew up in Boston and received both her undergraduate and graduate degrees from Harvard University. The Education Trap from Harvard University Press is her first book. Moderator, Dr. Hilary Moss, is a professor of history and Black studies and soon to be education studies at Amherst College in Western Massachusetts. Currently, she is a fellow at Victoria University in New Zealand, where she joins us from this evening. Dr. Moss's writing has been published in academic journals, and her book, Schooling Citizens: The African-American Struggle for Education in Antebellum America, was published by the University of Chicago Press. Welcome, Cristina and Hilary, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, Kristen. And I want to make sure I can see Cristina. And as Kristen pointed out, I'm joining you from Wellington, New Zealand. One of the things that is wonderful about this opportunity is that it is giving me a chance as an American historian to try to understand what ideas about public education and higher education are universal and what ideas are specific to American society. So I wanted to open our discussion tonight by talking a little bit about how American this story is. So I'm wondering, Tina, if you can begin by helping us understand why you think Americans continue to put so much faith in education as a mechanism for equalizing opportunity. How much of your story do you think is an American story? How much of it do you think might be generalizable to other democratic societies?
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you, Hilary, from zooming in at a very different time, and and to VPL and the GBH Forum Network for hosting this event. I think this question of what is American about this particular story, I think there is sort of a uniquely American quality to it. So, in the US, there is a very long tradition of understanding education as a means of not just of social mobility, but really as an equalizer, dating back to Horace Mann and his idea of, calling education the great equalizer, and this idea that education will reduce inequality. But a couple other features of American history are that the United States has had one of the kind of longest histories of very high levels of educational access and enrollment compared to other countries. And yet at the same time, in recent history in particular, since the 1970s, the US has had one of the highest levels of social inequality across the global north. So we have, I kind of start the book with this paradox that on the one hand, the United States is actually pretty good about making education accessible to a large number of people at higher rates than other countries, but it also has one of the highest levels of inequality in the world. So if we think that education is the best way to reduce inequality, this seems to pose sort of a challenge or a paradox. And in the book, I, rather than look at the more recent history, a lot of studies of inequality today look at developments since the 1970s, but I take us back to this earlier, the first Gilded Age, the late 19th and early 20th century, which was a period of both, large educational expansion, but also where inequality was about what it is today. It was also kind of at a peak. And by looking at that period, I try to explain, the foundation of how these two things can be compatible.
So as a historian of education, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a little bit about your own educational journey. But I'd like to do it in such a way that it sort of helps us learn more about your book and your book project. So one of the things that I'm wondering is, before you began this research, what were some of your own assumptions about education as it relates to social mobility? So did you also believe that education was the great equalizer? And how did those ideas help channel you into your research? And how did those ideas change throughout your research process?
Yeah, so I think the starting point of this project was really as an undergrad, reading the educational philosopher and sort of democratic theorist John Dewey, who was writing in the early 20th century, kind of in this time period, in the progressive era. And I really, was sort of captivated by his vision of education as a means of transforming the economy and really of creating what he called industrial democracy, but sort of, not just democracy in a political sense, but actually sort of equalizing the economy, giving workers more power and more empowerment. And he saw that as, starting in the school system. And the question then became for me, and this was sort of the question when I went back to grad school to start my dissertation, which then became this book, was, he was writing at a time of extreme inequality. Inequality sort of continues to go up after he writes his landmark study about education and democracy. So, why did his vision fail? What went wrong? And that led me to do a much more kind of social and labor and educational history of this time period, where I really try to look at how education and the modern corporate economy grew up together and were sort of fundamentally, tied together from the get-go. So at the same time that you have, new ideas about educational reform, they are interacting with the labor market in ways that actually become sort of a new, what I talk about is, creating a new basis of inequality that is now based on educational credentials as education becomes more important in the labor market.
So again, as a historian, I think I'm really curious about what you see as these key transformational moments or these points of contingency. You noted that a number of historians that are writing about inequality do so beginning in the 1970s. Why did you choose to begin your story when you did? And what do you think, if we're trying to take the long view, we should understand as those key moments of contingency in the period that you're writing about?
Yeah, so I think the early 20th century is late 19th, early 20th century is a really important period, because that was really when I argue that schools first became relevant to the job market in in sort of a fundamentally new way. So this is, I think, one of the benefits of historical research, of trying to like get into the mindset and the worldviews of people that lived a long time ago. But in the first chapter of my book, I sort of paint this portrait of, what did the Boston economy look like, and what were the common paths into work, or the pathways that individuals followed into, accessing jobs. And by and large, schools were pretty marginal. So most people didn't get beyond a primary school education. Most people learned their work, everything from craft workers in the trades to businessmen to even professionals like lawyers. They learned kind of on the job, right? They learned alongside a practitioner. So even lawyers usually didn't attend a designated professional school. They were often a little bit more well educated than their counterparts, but the actual process of learning work took place on the job. And the big shift between roughly 1880 and the 1930s that I trace is how school attendance rises across all classes, and racial and ethnic groups and genders. And it really sort of restructures access into most jobs in this period. So understanding sort of that shift, I think, tells us a lot about how inequality is also changing in that time period.
So one of the things that you and I have in common, even though we are 18 hours apart and in different days, is our mutual love of the Boston Public Library. And I will say that when I was working on my own book in graduate school, one of my favorite things was actually to take the train down and be in the reading room of the Boston Public Library. And I think it was actually that site and the manuscripts that were there that led me to want to write more about Boston. So I'm wondering for you, you can study inequality anywhere. Why, for you, did you choose to make Boston the center of your story?
Yeah, so I mean, Boston, in the time period that I'm looking at, Boston was a large commercial and industrial and sort of immigrant center. And in those ways, it shared a lot of characteristics with other Northern American cities, not the American South, which I think has a very distinctive history. But so in some ways, I think it's representative. I think what's unique about Boston and actually made it a really good place to look at education and the economy is, its very long and rich history of educational institutions. Both, I have a slide that shows some of the sources some of the archives that I used at the Boston Public Library, and one of the major ones was the Boston Latin School record. So one of the oldest public school in the United States. So both in terms of public education and a very, high enrollment and well-developed public school system. But of course, Boston also has some of the oldest private colleges and institutions. And so there's a very rich kind of institutional ecology of schools in both the public and private sector that all created archives, right? And all have a lot of amazing records to use for historical research, but also that I think help illustrate, how education and the economy interacted, which was sort of my main question. So I think its uniqueness also made it a really valuable place to look at this relationship. And so I used archival sources from many different institutions and libraries in the Boston area. I also made use of quantitative data, and I have another slide to show you what I used for that. So this is the IPUMS data, which is essentially digitized census data that we now have access to 100% samples of the United States censuses from 1880 to 1940. So basically, like every person in the census has been digitized, and you can access it by downloading these data sets. And with this quantitative data, I was able to get sort of really fine-grained numbers about work and educational trends and demographic trends. And just to show you one example of some of the charts that I have in the book. Yeah, here we go. So wage earners by sector, I found it just really helpful to have some basic numbers, about what is actually changing in Boston. And here you can see essentially how the sectors of work change over time between 1880 and 1940 for both men and women. And you'll notice, and we'll come back to some of these trends, I think, in a moment, but some of the biggest shifts are happening in the women's labor market, and particularly the decline of personal service, so the decline of work like being a domestic worker, a private household worker, and the expansion of clerical and sales work. And that was one of the really fundamental transformations of this period that also, I think it was very valuable to have kind of quantitative data to back up with some numbers.
So one thing that I find very interesting about your use of quantitative data, I actually had done some similar things in the early 19th century with manuscript censuses, but they were not put together in such an easy and beautiful form. And one of the things that became very clear was if you looked at African Americans in Boston and also the African American community more broadly, that there was very rarely a correlation between their desire for educational opportunity and their employment possibilities. So if you look, for example, at gender disparities, you were finding that African Americans were actually sending their daughters to work at much higher numbers, even though there was not necessarily any labor market that would make use of a classical education for African American women at the time. So I'd love to know if we go past 1860 and get into the period in which you're writing, how labor and race factored into your story. So if we're thinking about African Americans just as an example, how does the story that you're telling mesh with the African American experience? And I know African Americans are also in this period in time attending school in much greater numbers. So what's the story that's going on there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. This was something too that sort of through quantitative data I was able to find out a little bit more about, and led me to some surprises. So across races and genders and ethnicities, school attendance is going up, and I think the sort of the success story of this period is how white women, for the most part, are able to use schools to access new kinds of clerical and sales jobs. And if we go to a slide that shows women's high school enrollment, here we go. Yeah, you can see, this shows you I just have this image of women's enrollment, but this is a period known as the high school movement. A huge boom in women's attendance. Women and men's attendance in high school. And you can see that sort of divided by type or by course, and commercial is the biggest. And commercial referred to courses in, say, typewriting, stenography, commercial arithmetic, bookkeeping. These are the kinds of skills that are really valuable in new kinds of white collar work that are opening up, or clerical and sales jobs that are some of the fastest growing in new corporate bureaucracies and this new economy. So I found that, there is a real driver of educational, expansion and attendance in the experience of a lot of women who are, the children of immigrants, mostly white European women, in accessing these new jobs. However, as you mentioned, this education cannot sort of overcome blatant discrimination in the labor market. And if we go to the next slide that shows kind of school attendance, these are sort of the children of low wage workers, so working class children in Boston. You can see how African American rates are going up. Everyone is attending school in higher numbers over this time period. And actually African American rates are even higher than whites born in Massachusetts or whites born in Ireland, so Irish immigrants. And yet African Americans are almost entirely excluded from these jobs that white women are able to access. So they're, other than a few sort of Black owned businesses, the rates of Black white collar workers is extremely low. And I think this is one of the key arguments I think that I make in a number of ways, that education is limited in what it can affect in the labor market. And this is one of the clearest cases where the idea that just like more education will open up economic opportunity, it doesn't apply because it can't overcome these structural inequalities and barriers in the labor market.
I think then I'm trying to think of the best place to go from here. And you've talked a lot about the labor market and structural inequality. And I know with my students at Amherst College, we often like to also talk about agency, right? And we like to talk about who made particular choices and who had power and who didn't. And in this sort of structural argument, it looks like we're all sort of awash in a sea of economic forces beyond our control. But clearly we know that there are people that had power that made decisions, right? So who are the people that you feel like are either shaping this landscape or who benefit most from it? Where's the agency in your story?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think first, I really see a lot of, I think both bottom up and top down forces at play. So I think there are sort of some scholars of education that will stress, Marxist scholars of education that often stress like education as a tool for social control, right? Or shaping individuals to fit the labor market. And I think, there's a lot of merit in some of what those explanations can explain, but it doesn't quite take into account the fact that I think the reason education was so successful in expanding in this period was because it actually had a huge kind of cross-class support in this period. So working class people really wanted access to high schools to be able to send their daughters into white collar work. And at the same time, employers were also very happy to support more education because it meant that they didn't have, it took the burden of training workers off of them and placed it, on the public sector or onto these educational institutions. Progressive reformers also, like John Dewey, had high hopes for how education could transform society. So there are all kinds of interests and groups that are really, for different reasons, that see education as beneficial. And so I think there's a really important kind of grassroots story to tell here. At the same time, I also stress sort of the ways that elites in particular are able to use education to maintain their power. And this is mostly through the use of college degrees, or in reaction to this expanding landscape of high school education and women entering jobs that had been traditionally male in white collar work, immigrants entering jobs that had traditionally been just for native born men. There's sort of a reaction among elites, and that is to use college degrees. And I have one slide that just shows you it also, in fewer numbers, but really a similar trend to what's happening with high school. College education explodes in this period for both men and women. And I think the ways that these jobs I look at sort of jobs, the traditional professions, law, medicine, teaching, as well as really like most college students in this period are going into corporate management or going into the business world. And colleges become really important in mediating access into some of the, most lucrative, most powerful positions in the corporate economy. And through sort of using college degrees in this way, elites are able to maintain their power even as, other students are able to or achieve social mobility through high school at lower levels.
So there are a number of things that I think are really powerful about your story, and I'd like to just say a couple of them. One, I think, again, as a historian of education, it's pretty rare that people are studying both primary, secondary, and higher education. And I think one of the things that's really unique about what you do is you really are looking at that interplay. And I'd like to talk just in some of the remaining time that we have about some of the implications of the arguments that you're making. And in the introduction to your book, you're really powerful about some of the arguments that you're making, and you say them with a lot of clarity. And so one of the ones I wanted to have us talk a little bit about is this concept of merit. I work at a selective liberal arts college, and I teach students about different debates in educational opportunity, and we talk about merit pretty often. And you write in your book that you hope, and I'll just read the quote because you can say it better than I can, you hope to challenge us to reinterpret merit as a culturally constructed set of knowledges, behaviors, and values that reflect historically specific personal preferences and prejudices, often used by elites to maintain their power. Right, so I'd love to know what you mean by this. Is merit a myth? Is it something that is not only a myth, but is it also a very pernicious myth? And how does this help us think again about contemporary debates over access and opportunity, particularly at elite institutions? That's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of on like a very basic level, I think I'm trying to say like merit is a historical concept. There's no sort of one timeless definition of merit. And I think, in a lot of educational discourse still today, we use terms like, academically gifted, or even some people still talk about IQ as if, there's like this one timeless universal measure of what merit, which implies the deserving some sort of reward or some sort of benefit from having, and I want to show at any given point what was valued, the kinds of skills and behaviors and forms of knowledge that were valued at any given time have changed, and also were different depending on what level of education what level of education we're talking about, or what institution we're talking about. So first, I want to say just, we have to think historically about some of these concepts. And then I think to the question about, what are the pernicious effects of this? I think this was sort of most revealed to me when I was looking at the records of Harvard has records of their what's now like their career advancement center, but was called their placement office, and basically an office that was created to help Harvard alumni find jobs, and it's correspondence between employers and university officials, essentially talking about, who would be a good fit for this particular job or that particular job. And so this is really like a behind the scenes look at how people are talking about the qualities of a college graduate and what would be a good fit for different positions. And I found that, academic, traditional, what we would think of as academic merit, maybe in technical skills, of students that had taken economics or had certain scientific skills, that was a topic of, these conversations. But very often the conversations had a lot more to do with what extracurriculars a student had participated in, their sort of personal behaviors and habits and mannerisms, or their personality. sometimes very explicit, race, what religion they were, other sort of class-based indicators like whether they had accepted whether they were on scholarship or not. So basically all these ways that things that we would consider, even by any definition, like having nothing to do with one's merit, these became incorporated into how employers were deciding who to take on into their company or who to employ. And I think by revealing that backstory, we can see how the meaning of a college degree didn't just reflect, an academic credential. It was also kind of a cover for a lot of these other qualities, in a way that I think there's a great book by Lauren Rivera, a sociologist, called Pedigree, that looks at really sort of similar dynamics in the present about how law firms and consulting firms sort of recruit at elite institutions. And she finds a lot of the same things of, how other kinds of class-based characteristics or racial characteristics are still used in this hiring process, but now elites sort of have the cover of a degree, well, it's because I went to this fancy school, rather than, because I happen to also be from a wealthy background, that I'm now getting access into an elite job. So that's something that I think has a longer legacy and still is something shaping higher education today.
So I'll ask a couple of questions that are, as a historian, always questions I hate being asked. But the joy is that I don't have to answer them. I'll just throw them out there and we'll see what we can do with it. So I think one of the most powerful aspects of living through COVID today is that it is really making us rethink so many aspects of American education. I know, as somebody that was teaching and didn't have access to childcare, I have never loved and appreciated schools more than when I had to live without them. I think that's also one of the main reasons we moved to New Zealand, was we wanted our children to be able to go to an in-person school. So I'm hopeful that with all of the sort of trauma that America has gone through, that it might also allow us time to think about how we want to remake our institutions, particularly around issues of access, diversity, opportunity, and inequality. So I'm wondering if you could help us think about, if we look at this as hopefully we're living through a transformative moment, and something good has got to come out of all of this, how would you like to see institutions of higher education or secondary institutions rethink issues of access and opportunity in a moment when so many different tools are on the table?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a moment to rethink a lot of things. I think what COVID exposed was really the lack of a social safety net in the United States in particular. And it revealed also the way that schools have just, have taken on so many functions that in other countries might be covered by other parts of the welfare state. So something like childcare, right, is like a primary function of schools, rather than having designated, fully funded daycare and childcare provision, or having more parental and sick leave, if someone gets sick from COVID. So, I think schools really have been overburdened, and this is another point that other historians have made too, that the American welfare state is sort of based around and in our school system in some ways, because schools have been popular, but other forms of social welfare have not been popular. The problem, though, I think is that now, because of rising inequality, that's not just that COVID only just sort of exposes even more blatantly, but is something that that has been rising since the 1970s. That I think we've also, I would hope, have like come to see how the idea that more skills or more training is somehow going to get us out of our, you know, completely divided economy, is going to overcome these other structural barriers. I think, or I would hope that COVID would also reveal that, although still too often there are, you know, more op-eds saying to address unemployment, like we just need to train people. It's like, well, if there's no jobs, or if jobs are unsafe to go to, you know, we can't really solve inequality in that way. So I think, and I'll also say, I think the sort of debate over school reopening really unfortunately pitted, you know, teacher unions versus parents in a way that I think sort of totally missed the point, that like teachers also wanted to be able to return to school, but what they were requesting was sort of adequate funding for things like soap and ventilation and sick leave and other sort of public resources that would have made it possible, right, for teachers and parents to really be on the same page politically. But instead, you know, and again in US history, we see ways that constituents are divided when actually they share a lot of common interests that would, you know, together could have demanded, say, more public funding to actually ensure that schools were safe, or a better COVID response, or more the ability to take time off from work and things like that. So I think looking at a big argument of the book is thinking about the overburdening of education and sort of a lack of thinking about the balance of power, especially labor and sort of the power between workers and employers in the economy, and trying to shift us to think more about some of those broader policies that don't just have to do with education.
And I think this really gets us back to thinking about what is so particularly American about this story. And you open again with saying America has the highest expenditure on education of almost any Western democracy, and it has high school attendance rates. But there is this tremendous inequality. And I think the piece that's missing that you pointed out, right, is that America is using schools as its welfare state, right? So while it's spending a ton of money on education, it's not doing so in other places. I know in Amherst, the very first thing that the superintendent of schools was working on was making sure that kids who needed access to meals could still get access to meals when the schools were closed. And that is, again, it's a particularly American model of really thinking about schools as that sort of, I think Michael Katz has said, that sort of fourth arm of the welfare state. So given that we know this, do you have any reason to be optimistic? So I am starting off, I write about education in the 1830s, and I can see it as a mechanism of inequality. We are writing about it in the late 19th, early 20th century. We know it's a mechanism of inequality. Historians in the 70s know that it's a mechanism of segregation and inequality. But we've got Horace Mann, who's still saying it's the great equalizer. And we both work for institutions of higher education. So is there any reason to be optimistic, or are there any changes that you could see that might give us hope sort of moving forward?
Yeah, so I think here's also where I think history is illuminating too. So I have one last slide about, I use this chart a lot for teaching, but sort of history of inequality in the United States. So this shows income share held by the top 10% of earners. And you can see in the early 20th century, it's very high, and then it goes down, and there is a real drop in the middle of the 20th century before rising again, starting in the 1970s, 80s. And I think, you know, another argument of my book is that, you know, a lot of, especially economists, have looked at this, and they have argued that one of the primary reasons that inequality went down in the mid 20th century was because of massive public educational expansion. So in this period of time, it was public higher education and colleges, but sort of massive investment then allowed more workers to compete in sort of new, highly skilled technical jobs, and that lowered inequality. And what we're seeing now, according to many economists, is there's not enough skilled workers. There's not enough, education is not rising fast enough to enable workers to have the skills that they need to access, technical jobs. And I sort of find that historically, I don't think public education can really explain most of what we're seeing. I think a lot more of the reasons that inequality declined in the middle of the 20th century have to do with, who had power in the economy. And this was a period of kind of the height of the labor movement, where over a third of workers belonged to labor unions, and they were the political basis for federal programs that expanded our welfare state in the New Deal through the Great Society. And a lot, what we have seen now in recent years is, the labor movement declining, or a percentage of workers in unions has really shrunk. Labor rights and a lot of social welfare programs have been eroded. And so I think what I would see as, the reason for hope, or sort of what we're seeing in the present, I think there has been a real revival of, seeing policies like policy proposals like the Green New Deal that explicitly recall this earlier period of seeing especially young people involved in new political campaigns, like Bernie Sanders, to the defund the police movement that young people have also been behind. Like, I think there is a real revival of political interest in many of these, recognizing that the role of government is to, provide social services, and a new interest in the labor movement. And I think that has helped shift the debate away from one that is focused on, skills and training being the solution, to one that's actually, even if we increase skills, if elites can always develop new mechanisms of controlling access to the top positions, then what we're going to see is just sort of this credentials race. Like, if it's not a college degree, it'll be a master's degree, or it'll be a professional degree later on. So education on its own can't solve that process if we're in an extremely unequal economy. So what it's going to take is really, we're seeing this in the role of teacher unions, healthcare workers that are organizing, really trying to rebuild worker power in large sectors. And I think that can also become the basis of like a reoriented political direction, and hopefully a return to more progressive welfare policies.
So this is, I think, a good moment for me to step back a little bit, and I have the great fortune of getting some questions from the audience, and so I'm going to do my best to articulate them and put them forward. And it looks like, not surprisingly, a couple of people in the audience really want us to be thinking critically and talking more about issues of race. And so one question that has been put forth is, how does racial discrimination, including the quality of and access to education, factor into your thinking? So we've talked a little bit about that as it relates to the labor market, but what about racial discrimination in education as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. And I think it's interesting, in the period of time that I'm looking at in Boston, Boston was, another unique feature about Boston was that compared to a lot of other northern cities, it had a very small African-American population, about 3% in this period, which interestingly meant that that segregation in schooling in this period at least was much less than other Northern American cities, because there wasn't the same sort of residential segregation. Even in the South End, which was the neighborhood that had the highest percentage of African Americans in this period in Boston, they weren't a majority of that neighborhood. So in local schools, these schools were more successfully integrated. This really changes after 1940, and Boston has its own, well-known history of extreme segregation and debates in schooling over busing and desegregation orders. But what was so interesting in this period is I think there was extremely high attendance of African Americans, and schools were a bit more integrated. Here's where I think, sort of in thinking about the present, I think there are sort of obvious ways that education could be more equally funded, right? There's no reason to fund schools via property taxes. We should have free college for all and the cancellation of student debt. To me, those seem sort of like the minimum policies that would not just, address class disparities, but also really address racial disparities in education. And yet at the same time, recognizing that, again, like, even if African Americans are more educated than white job applicants, we know that simply having an African American sounding name is going to be a factor in exclusion from jobs. So I think we have to think about education in conjunction with the labor market in order to actually sort of meaningfully provide opportunities to address these racial disparities.
Mm-hmm. There's another great question that I think will help open up discussion. And there's a member of the audience who asks, wasn't one of the reasons for the great equalizing of education, starting around the time of World War II, the GI Bill, right? And again, for those of us who teach on African American history, one of the first things we'll say is absolutely the GI Bill, because African Americans were often excluded from its benefits, right? And so how, if we think about the GI Bill just as an example of some of the trends that you're talking about, how does the state factor into this story, or sort of the hidden hand of the federal government, or the hidden hand of the state in these trends that you're articulating, maybe using the GI Bill as an example?
Yeah, I think in some ways we can compare the story or the history of post-World War II expansion of public higher education through things like the GI Bill with something like the high school movement, which granted was sort of at the local level and secondary education. But in both of those ways, it was the public sector that I think, was really responding to working class demand. It was making opportunities more available to populations that had not had access before. So women, second generation immigrants, with all the caveats of, in both of those cases, limited opportunities for African Americans. But I think, the idea that the public sector really did expand access to underserved populations. At the same time, the argument I want to make about what's happening sort of in reaction and by elites is that even if you get this huge expansion of educational access and you go from, most people not attending high school to high school becoming a norm, that doesn't necessarily equalize the economy. Right. It doesn't equalize society, because elites then just sort of add on another layer or, another kind of form of exclusion, be it through a higher educational credential or a more prestigious or elite institution, right? So you get the distinction between and sort of these status differentiation between a lot of public institutions or community colleges versus elite, often private colleges. So I think because of the ways that elites can often, create new ways of retaining their power, that's why educational expansion doesn't, it can be a factor in, but it's not a sufficient condition for inequality actually declining, which has to do with these broader structural power dynamics, I think.
So one of the things I love about audience questions is that they always help me think about areas that we haven't talked a lot about that are really important. And so we have a question from the audience that is talking about what's going on inside classrooms and the curriculum. And I want to just read a couple words because I think it's a really smart and powerful question. Lynn writes, for those of us invested in what happens inside the classroom, what are the curricular implications that are woven into this story? And by extension, what are the curricular approaches that we can embrace that can challenge the narrative and educate for policy change? Can education play a useful role even if it doesn't offer the solution? So I'm imagining that this is a person who's a teacher. I hope it's somebody who will one day become a teacher. But I think what Lynn is asking us, right, is what's actually going on inside the schools. And if we take the power of education seriously and not just schools as institutions, how can education be something that we might be able to harness to promote social mobility, right? We haven't talked about the difference between education and schooling, but I would do that with my students. So let's think more about education and the curriculum. And thank you, Lynn, for that question. It's fabulous.
Yeah, no, and great question. And I feel like sometimes I keep sort of shifting the debate away from education, but of course, structure. Most people interested in education and inequality
want to know about education
are educators. Yeah, and I think it's totally correct to have to be asking what we can do. And I mean, one of the ways that I've been thinking about this question is trying to sort of reimagine the boundaries and what we mean by education, and kind of break out of a more standard understanding of education as training or relevant for jobs, but in the sense that I see students organizing Black Lives Matter protests in their classrooms, and then going, walking out of school, or the way that students often, are very invested in supporting their teachers who are organizing in their unions. I think there are lots of ways that students are learning and kind of gaining the skills and experiences of what sort of real political and economic empowerment look like, even at a very young age and while they're students. And to me, like that's also that's a form of political education. Maybe that's also, we can say that also gets at like, what Dewey really had in mind of like putting democracy in practice, but not just seeing it as something that's, going to happen in the future, but kind of developing real political engagement already as students. I think that's something, that form of education and getting involved in one's community, and even at the very local level of thinking about the school as a workplace, which in some ways, because of the success story of education, like is one of the largest sectors of employment. If we take that seriously, that I think can open up new ways of thinking about like what can students learn within the classroom, and thinking critically about their own school, I mean, this is something in Chicago, the teachers union has really pioneered this idea of bargaining for the common good. So like in the fight for a teacher's contract, it's also about making demands for addressing student homelessness, or addressing having enough nurses in the classroom. And if students are exposed and sort of learn about that debate and use that to learn about where public resources are going, whether or not police officers or school resource officers should be in their classrooms. I think that's a more promising way of thinking about education for, I think what will be a very long struggle ahead if we really want to try to reduce inequality in a broader way.
So I think we're getting close to time, and I'm trying to figure out what would be a good way of sort of wrapping up. And I think one of the last questions that I have, again, thinking about myself first and foremost as a teacher, is I would also want to know, what is the role of students in this story, and what should the role of students be? In colleges and universities right now, students are activists, right? And students are really pushing us to think about new ways of understanding merit and equality. And one of the things I love about your book, and I think I said this to you when we spoke, is I can't wait to teach this, right? This is a book that belongs in a classroom. And so we've talked a little bit about the role of teachers and the role of the government, but what do you see really as the ways in which you want students to understand the story that you're talking about, and how might they carry that forward to making hopefully a more equal society? And you were a high school teacher too, so this should be right.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In the book itself, I try to stress the agency of many different actors, including students who, really sort of voting with their feet, chose what kinds of schooling they wanted to have, also chose to, not go to certain schools or that were offering skills or kinds of education that they didn't think were relevant. And I think students have a lot of power in shaping the educational system. I think one sort of common way of describing, or I don't know, reflecting on what's happening in education today is to talk about, the career interests of students, or sort of the vocationalization of education. And to try to, often from a teacher's perspective or an educator's perspective, lamenting the fact that students are very concerned with, right, how their education is going to translate into a job. I think I want to, in some ways, the book sort of historicizes that and argues, it's perfectly legitimate for students who are facing, an extremely unequal economy with very few well-paying jobs. It's understandable that they are so concerned with their future and often sort of think about education in that way. I think if as educators we want to, if we want education to sort of be free for other purposes and to try to redefine, what an education could be, I think, we have to address the lack of jobs, on that end too. And I think that in some ways if we could sort of address the labor market side, that would open up education to be, kind of a whole host of other things that both teachers and students would really benefit from. But, education is sort of being held hostage right now by our terrible economy. And that's affecting, how students are approaching education. And I think limiting a lot of what teachers are able to do in even despite sort of our best intentions and our goals.
Thank you very much. I think at this point we are running close to time. I really wanted to thank Tina and also thank the audience. I didn't get a chance to answer or to ask most of the questions, but there's some really powerful ones. I could talk about STEM education forever, but we didn't get to that as well. And I'd like to thank the Boston Public Library for giving us this opportunity to be together, even though I am so far apart. We're so far away.
Thank you so much, Hillary and Cristina. Thank you for your conversation, sharing your insight and caring with us as well. Before we leave this evening, just a few words of thanks. First of all, to our audience, just to echo what Hillary just said, thank you all for joining us for this conversation between Dr. Cristina Groeger and Dr. Hillary Moss.